Hi, I'm Jo from J.H.Leather, and in this video we'll be making the rolled throat of our head collar. Let's get started. Okay, so last time we made our head shapes and our headpiece. So the headpiece can go to one side for the moment because we will be making our rolled throat. So we'll keep these, but we'll just move these to one side for the moment. So to start with, we will get our 1 1/8 piece of leather, which is what we will be using to make our rolled throat. And we'll find the best end. So once you found the best end, we're just going to square that off. And what we're going to do is mark out for our turn. So we want this to have about 1 to 1 1/4 inch tuck in. And then the whole turn is going to be 3 inches long. But what we want to do is we're going to mark 1/4 inch back on either end, because this bit's going to be cut down to 7/8 of an inch wide. You should have something marked out that looks a little bit like that, and then we're going to set our dividers to 1/8 of an inch, which mine already are, so we can have 7/8 of an inch wide turn. And then just with your ruler, we're going to just taper these ends out. Like so. So the overall size of our throat is 16.5 inches, but we need to do some splitting because basically this isn't, obviously being this thick, it's not going to roll. So what we will do is we're going to mark roughly the overall length, and then we can split it, cut it to length, and then we will actually cut the turns out afterwards. Okay, so what you want to do is just mark the middle of your turns, that's 1.5 inches, and then with a tape measure we are going to measure 16.5, and that's going to be to the centre of the other turn. So add on to that at least an extra 1.5 inches, and just mark it on the edge here of your leather, and then transfer it to the back, and again we can transfer. So I'm actually transferring from this 1/4 inch mark onto the back, just so that it is split a bit underneath there. So you should have something a bit like this, and what we will do is on the other end we're going to do a test bit to see how thin or thick we can split this. Okay, so once you have split your test piece and you are happy with what you have, we can then split between the 2 marks on our strap, and we want to just stop about 1 inch or so short from the second mark, just to allow for any stretching, and then we can sort of split from the other side once we know how much it has stretched. So you can see mine has only stretched a little bit, so that's not too bad, but I am now going to remeasure it just to make sure that it ends up in the equivalent space of here. Right, so you should have your strap looking a bit like this one, and so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to draw on our turn onto the other side of our strap, and then we can cut that down to size. We're just going to double check and remark once again our 16.5 inches, because that's where the centre of the other side of the turn is going to be. And then once we have that in place, that's there. So once we've done that, we can then add our turn. So once you've got your sort of turn marked out, we want to add another 1.5, sort of 1 to 1.5 inches on the other side, and this is going to be our tuck in once we do our stitching. And once you've marked that out, you can then use your head knife and cut that straight. So you should have something that looks a little bit like this. So we can now cut around these. Okay, so hopefully you have something that looks a little bit like this with your two turns cut out on your rolled throat. So what we're going to do now is with our number 1 edge tool, we're going to edge on the grain side just around these two turn cutouts. And then once we've done that, we're going to head over and stain and crease around these two turns. So what we want to do is just stain and polish, and then we're going to crease just around the two sort of buckle turns sort of that we have made. Okay, so once you have stained and creased both ends of your rolled throat, what we can do is we can start making the turn. So you might need to wet your turn because you don't want your leather to crack. And you can do that with just some warm water. What we want is to get that nice and flat there. And then this is going to go in here. We're actually going to stitch mark this side of it because this is going to be what's facing out once we've got the rest of our head collar together. So once you've got that nice and tight here, as tight as you can to that ring, you can then mark with your thumbnail where that is, and then we'll do the same on the other side as well. So once you've drawn your marks on, you just want to even them up onto the other side with your set square. And then with your divider set to your stitching width, which is usually, for me, about 1/8 of an inch, we're just going to draw our stitch line on. And so we're just going to want to go around the end just a little bit here, so not too much. And what we're going to do is we're going to stitch mark along this line. So that's all the stitch marks we're going to do. So it's just 6 stitch marks in total there. Okay, so once you've done stitch marking either end, we need to stitch mark this bit here. So what we want to do is we're just going to wet this a little bit. So what we want to do is just wet this sort of rolled section a little bit, because when we stitch it we will have it sort of wet. Show you a bit closer, so then you can use your thumbnail here and you can see sort of that will be nice and rolled around the filler. And then so once you have your mark line, which mine is about 1/8 of an inch, we can then draw on our 2 stitching lines. So what we're going to do is we can then stitch mark from this corner all the way to the other end. And what we're going to do is, if you have available a right and a left-handed stitch marker, that's ideal. And we'll stitch side one with the right-handed and the other side with the left-handed. If not, you can just use just a normal right-handed stitch marker. So by using the 2, when we stitch through it, the stitch marks on the other side that we're not awling from will be sort of in the same or the right direction for when the awl comes out. Right, so what we have to do now is just skive down these 2 ends to nothing. So generally I'll start from about back here, so we've got a nice thin sort of bit through the actual turn once we get stitching. And now you want a nice sharp knife for this. So if you need to take a minute, go sharpen it now, it's going to make things a lot easier for you in the long run. And now this is actually like a granite tile that I'm using for skiving on. It just gives a nice smooth surface and makes things a bit easier to skive to, because you've not got all the lumps and bumps that you would have otherwise. So when you tack the throat on, you want to make sure that this fancy, or the knife, the sort of stitching side, is facing out, so that once it's on, it's going to be going around that way. Okie dokie, so we're now going to double hand stitch our turns on. And like always, we're going to start with 1 back stitch, and then when you get into this last stitch, what we can do, rather than sort of starting a whole new thread for the other side, you can actually come out in between the layers. pull these tight and go back through to the other side. So if you're going to do that, you need to just do sort of an extra sort of stitch back. So you're going to all through the second to last and the third to last holes, come out in the third to last holes, and then go back to the end. So you'll effectively have 1.5 back stitches. And I'm actually going to do 2.5 back stitches on this end. But you can still just do 1.5 if you want, it's not a problem. And so once you've done one side, we then need to go and stitch the other side in the same way. So you should have something that now looks a little bit like this. We just need to prepare our filler. So as I said, I'm using a rope filler for mine. So we just want to trim the ends and just seal this so it doesn't fray. And so this is going to run on the inside between here and here. So we can cut this, we'll cut it roughly to length, and then we'll cut it to actual length when we get near the end. And now to make this easy to stitch and so we don't crack any of it, what we're going to do is we're actually going to put some warm water on it, not boiling, we just want some warm. So it might look really hot in here, but that's more because it's really cold in here. So what we're going to do is just wet our rolled section. So if you're using a light coloured leather, you just need to be a bit more sort of careful here, because you don't want your colours to run out or anything. You really want to make sure you get some water in this sort of double turn, sort of layered area, because that's obviously going to be more tough to turn because it's got a bit of a thicker layer there. And so it's likely you're going to find these sort of turn areas a bit more difficult to actually turn. So we can actually persuade them a little bit with a hammer, just to turn these awkward bits a bit more. Just so we can now get this turn nice and tight there. And we can tap all the way along. So you can see that's now a lot tighter too. Turn there. And so once you're happy you've got that nice and tight, we can then put our filler in. And you might need to tap it around with that also. And then once you're happy, we can then double hand stitch our rolled throat. So when we're stitching the rolled throat, this first stitch is usually the hardest because we've got obviously the double layers here and the filler underneath. So it is a bit fiddly to get that first stitch in, but once you've done that, the rest are a bit easier. We want to make sure we get that nice and tight. We don't want to see any of that thread. And as always, we have started with a back stitch. And for these first few stitches, we want to make sure we stitch through this tab as well. But once you've done that, the rest of it, compared to that bit, is pretty easy. It is a bit tough on your hand doing rolled work, which is why I generally prefer not to do rolled work, but it is what it is. And all we're doing is awling from one stitch mark into the other, which we have pre-marked onto the other side, and we're just going to stitch this all the way along. Okay, so when you are sort of almost towards the end of your stitching, we basically need to cut our filler down to the right size so it can actually fit in. So once we know how long it needs to be, we can just trim the end off like so. And then again, because this is rope, we're going to melt the end. If you're using sort of like a leather filler, like I spoke about, then what you would do is actually skive this end down a bit. So we're just going to melt it and then make a mess on the desk. Oh, I really melted it that time. Lovely. Once you have done that, you just want to tuck the end in underneath, and then when you get to stitching this side, it will all be in the right place. And so what we're going to do now is just finish stitching this last bit, and then we will start shaping our rolled throat. So when you get to the end of the stitching, you want to do 2 to 3 back stitches for this. So you can get it nice and tight. and then trim off your threads. Right, so now you have finished stitching your throat, we now need to just fancy this up a bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our number 6 edge tool, and if you have one, sort of a clicker knife, and we will just sort of fancy this edge up and get it nice and rolled. So first what we're going to do with our clicker knife is just trim the excess from under the tab, just to get that nice and flush. And we can also just sort of shape around these corners a bit, get them nice and round. And obviously we'll do the same on the other side. Right, so once we have trimmed the ends, what we're going to do is use our number 6 edge tool, and we are going to edge along this, the length of the throat. Now you want to do this sort of in stages and just build up your sort of edging, how much you're taking off, and we're just going to go as close to the stitching as possible, but obviously we don't want to cut them, so we do need to be a bit careful, and this is a bit of a fiddly job. Okay, so once you've done stitching, you can use sort of a tool that looks a little bit like this. This is basically just a handle with some grooves in it. One's 3/8 and one is 1/2 inch. And you can just use this along the edge of your rolled throat just to make it a bit more round. If you don't have one of these, you can always do it with a bone folder. It's not a problem. So you should now have something that looks a little bit like this, and what we're now going to do is just restain and recrease this. So hopefully you have something that looks a little bit like this with your 2 head shapes and your rolled throat. In the next episode, we'll be going on to learn how to create the noseband and the 2 jowls. So that is the end of this video. If you liked the video, please click the thumbs up button and subscribe for more videos and tutorials, and I'll see you in the next episode.